How many properties would you need to rent out to retire early here in the UK? This is something I ask myself all the time because my whole reason for investing in property alongside my 9-to-5 day job is to create financial freedom and hopefully make work optional for myself in the future. So today let's figure out your early retirement number based on your goals, not mine. We'll go net, tax, buffer on the board, then divide by a realistic per property net. And I'll show a sane route to build it too, plus what the next 20 years might do for you. This is all general information, not financial advice, so you can run your own numbers and get them verified by a professional. So step one is to pick a net monthly income that actually fits your life. So whether that's £2,000, £3,000 or £4,000 a month, or even more if you want to splurge a bit. Now, unfortunately, you want to stack on the boring but important bits. 25 to 30% tax. And then a reasonable buffer, I'm putting 25%, which covers things like voids, maintenance, and just general life happening. So like maybe a boiler needs replacing. So roughly £2,000 actually becomes £3,250-ish. £3,000 becomes £4,875-ish. And £4,000 becomes £6,500-ish. So this is what you need per month to meet the current lifestyle that you want to have. But remember, these are just planning numbers, so speak to an accountant for your exact position and see what they recommend as your monthly income. So this is your net, plus your tax, plus your buffer. By the way, I have a property investment spreadsheet that models this cleanly. Tax, buffers, refinance timing. The link's in description, it's totally free, I'm just letting you know. So now that you know your number, you have to move on to step two, which is converting it to actual properties. So properties obviously hugely vary, so we're gonna have to talk about averages here. The majority of investment properties here in the UK are just simple single lets. So let's use that as the assumption. And I've purchased that single let, say, using the BRRR strategy, which is actually my go-to. I'll put a link up here with more info on what the BRRR strategy is. But it's basically how to purchase a property, get most of your money back and rent it as a single let. I do that for the majority of my properties and I think it works really well for my lifestyle. Continuing with the thought of averages, the average rent in the UK for a single let at the time of recording this video is £1,348 a month. So that's just over 16k a year. Given that the investments that I tend to go for look for a 7% rental yield as a minimum, that gives an average rental property price of 230k. So I divide 16,000 by 7. So that 230k is not necessarily what the market value of the property is. It's what I've invested into it. Like I bought it for a cheaper amount and I renovated it and my total amount invested is 230k and I'm getting 7% rental yield, which is £1,348 a month. Let's do a quick mortgage example. I'm buying a property which is worth £230,000 with a 75% LTV, which is around £173,500, I think. It's interest only at 4%, which is pretty reasonable for right now. Including a reasonable product fee, there's probably a monthly mortgage of about £600 a month. So that's my mortgage example. So let's put all those numbers down to see how much we'd actually make net. Your rent, maybe £1,300, which is the average for the UK that we're talking about. The mortgage, as we discussed, for a property worth £230,000, which is that 7% rental yield, that would be about £600 a month. We'll have to have management of the property too, which is about 10% for the management that I use. You can manage it yourself, but for the sake of these numbers, try and be conservative. If you've got 10 properties, it's unlikely that you're going to find time to manage it yourself. So I'm going to add this number on. And then let's add on insurance and maintenance as well. I tend to pay about £20 per month on average for the insurance of a property that I let. And for simplicity, I'm going to put £80 a month for the maintenance of a property worth about 230k. I think that's fairly reasonable as an estimate. So totaling that all up, that would leave you £470 a month of net income before taxes. So let's plan for £450. It's a bit of an easier number and it helps us stay a bit conservative. Now I know this sounds quite high, and it may be high if you're looking at the lower end of the market and looking to get started in property. But remember, this is all on the average of the UK. So as deals get bigger, your net income grows too. And you may end up with properties way higher than this or way lower than this. So I think it's a fairly safe average to go for. And your numbers will vary, but it gives you the idea. Now let's see how that looks for our end goal of retiring early. Well, you take your buffered target amount, and depending on how lavishly you want to live, is going to translate to how many lets you're going to need to get there. So in actual fact, to achieve £3,250 a month net, you're going to need 7.25 lets, all monthly generating you £450 a month income. And that will give you the £3,250 a month for that lifestyle that you want, all passive. Because remember, this number is managed too. But for a mid-level lifestyle, that's 11 lets. And for a pretty lavish lifestyle, that's 14.5 lets. So that might sound like a lot of lets, and honestly it is, especially as they're the average for the entire UK. But that's just the reality of building proper passive income. It takes time. You're not going to be able to get 7 average lets in 1 year, But believe me, it is doable over time with some persistence and grit, and also smart choices. So maybe by watching this video, you're on the right lines to making those smart choices. So long term, you might question these numbers because costs go up. Yes, this example is planning in today's pounds with today's averages, but rents tend to rise with inflation too. So the shape broadly works. Still, I would stress test with flat rent just to stay conservative. With these kind of figures and looking ahead, it's always best to stay as conservative as reasonably possible, because you know that way that if things turn out really good, then your numbers are even better. But if they haven't, you've stayed within those expectations. Step 3, let's bring it back down to reality. From a lender perspective, when they're trying to lend you the money to have these lets, there are 3 things that they really care about. First is deposit. So most buy-to-let mortgages want 25% down, plus the fees on top. The next is stamp duty. Additional properties in the higher rate tax bands add a chunky bill, so you must model it. And then the third thing that lenders care about is ICR stress tests. So the rental income must cover a stressed interest payment. In case the mortgage interest rates rise, then it won't pass and they won't lend to you. But aside from the lender perspective, you have your own personal perspective too. First off, remember how important the running costs are. So full management is often that 10 to 15% of rent. 2, make sure to keep that maintenance pot. I know I put £80 down as just an estimated figure, but it's really important that you do put that money aside for the maintenance. And then the third, alongside the lender, is stress test your own deals at 1% additional interest and assume 1 month void per let. Call this the self-stress. The point is making sure that you can still afford it if the whole market goes to pot. And my fourth and final one, which is something that I really try and do for myself, is lower your expectations of the net income. If my number before was exempling with £450 a month, I would maybe look at instead using £400 a month. It's far better to be too conservative than too optimistic. I really mean that. Now for the fourth step, I know that I exampled using BRRR or single lets, but you need to know your strategy. So what I'm emphasizing here is know the strategies that are available and know which one you prefer ahead of time. I was using vanilla single lets for a reason. They're simple, lower stress and repeatable. Yes, HMOs and serviced accommodation can give you more cash flow, but they're time heavy. They can work brilliantly for some people in some situations, but I usually recommend starting simpler and then also ending simpler too. Like for myself, I want to end up with only simple, easy single lets in my portfolio when I look to just use passive income, because that's hopefully more stress-free. What's the point in considering it an early retirement if I'm just ending up spending every evening constantly sorting out issues? As a side note, if you want my current view on 2025 strategies that I actually recommend with all the rules that are changing for property here in the UK, then I'll pop a link up there to that. Step 5 is ownership structure. Decide your ownership structure and have it set up ahead of time. Quick context, I still own property in my personal name with my wife jointly, because at the time I didn't know to use a limited company, because I didn't realize it was advantageous to my situation. But since then, and doing a huge amount of research, my latest investments have been in a limited company. And why, might you ask? I'm a high rate taxpayer, I'm reinvesting now rather than drawing any income from it, and I like the clean separation and bookkeeping of a company. Plus, it makes things a bit easier if my wife wants to contribute some work to the company later and then earn a salary too. But be warned with this decision, there are definite trade-offs. So limited mortgages are typically pricier, there's extra accounting involved, and when you take money out from a limited company, it's from the post-corporation tax profits. If you want a bit more depth on limited company versus personal ownership, I'll link a video up here on me comparing the two, especially for rental income. So far we've mainly talked about the short term, like the net numbers, but what we should do is think about the long term. So this is step 6, and there are usually 2 quiet forces that help in the long term. So the first is rent drift versus fixed debt. If rent grows even 2% a year and your costs grow slower, then your net income will rise. For example, that £450 a month net today might be £550 by year 10, and then maybe £670 by year 20. And that's using that 2% conservative number. This means that each property can carry more of your goal over time. And even though this is increasing, your debt for the property remains the same. So for example, if interest rates stayed the exact same after 10 years and you haven't paid off anything additional on the property, it's the same amount of debt, then your net income would have increased by £100. But that brings me on to my second quiet force in the long term, which is equity and capital growth. So I personally don't build my retirement plan on this, but over 20 years it's worth acknowledging because even modest growth adds up. So if we think about 2.5% a year, that over 20 years would be 1.6 times the property value. If we think about 3% a year, that over 20 years would be 1.8 times the value. And 5% a year would be 2.6 times the value. But I'd plan lower on 5%. I think 2.5% to 3% is fairly reasonable. The point is, over time, you might be able to sell one property in your portfolio to pay down two, or remortgage to reduce the stress. That's why many older landlords now own big chunks outright and enjoy the strong cash flow. They've shifted their portfolio around after years and years of capital growth to own their properties outright. So if you had 10 properties and you owned 25% of each, after 20 years, if they've been doubled in value, you'll be able to buy 5 of them outright and then get rid of the other 5 to pay for those. And so for just waiting for those 20 years, generating cash flow too, you now own 5 properties outright. Those were very simple numbers. I'm excluding any kind of fees and tax on top of that, but you get my drift. All right, so step 7, my penultimate step, is setting yourself a quick but realistic pace. Your pace really depends on what cash you have available, but if we think about the average UK salary, which is £37,000 a year right now, could be wrong on that, but please correct me if I am. That's about £2,500 after tax per month. And if you manage to live frugally and maybe save £1,000 a month of that, which would be £12,000 a year, then you should be able to get your first investment property purchased and let before the end of year 2. But imagine you did buy that first let. If it then nets you £450 a month, like we were talking about before tax, then you might be able to save £16,000 in that next year. And then that £16,000 would let you purchase your next let in just over 1 year. And then if that then nets you £20,000 in your third year and you use the same process to buy another property, that means you can get a property in about 1 year. A bit of dedication and persistence now can start a snowball effect that nets you more and more as you go, and you'll be able to get more and more momentum. But there's a final step, and believe me, it's an easy one, because it's everything we've actually talked about so far. Just establish your action plan based on what we've discussed. So you really want to frame it in your mind, what you're aiming for and how you're going to get there. Because visualizing that path forward counts for so much. It helps you refine the decisions that you're making, possibly the properties that you're purchasing, how much you're saving every month. And that focus will help you get to where you want to be. So I would get my number of how much I know I need to live off every month. I would divide that by £450 for a rough average UK property count. I would sanity check that deposit, SDLT, ICR before booking any viewings. I would then pick a strategy that you have time for and that you'll actually follow, and I'd still advise single lets first and then add complexity later if you want. And then 5, I would keep your pension contributions going, keep your ISA and LISA topped up while you're still salaried. I would try and save as much as possible to get more cash flow. So this step should focus your mind to aim for that early retirement just like I am. So let's wrap this video up. How many average UK properties do you need to retire early? Somewhere that's between 7 and a dozen vanilla single lets in today's pounds. But over time, rents tend to rise, equity builds, and each one carries more of your number. We're not relying on it, but it definitely helps. And it's the reason why landlords from years ago are in such a good financial position now. And for me, this is exactly why I started investing, to build financial freedom alongside my 9-to-5 day job. And then one day hopefully have a choice to step back from that job and spend more time with my family. This is how I'm planning my route as a higher rate tax earner though. Your path may be different. Do your own numbers and make sure you get professional advice. For a great next step, watch my video that I'll link floating over here somewhere on how I'd start property investing in the UK with £20,000. If this helped you map your number or refine your thinking, please like the video down below. It really helps content like this reach more UK investors. And if you want more plain English breakdowns, please consider subscribing too. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.